Welcome. Ever find yourself debating between like a fancy coffee and that online impulse buy?
Hmm.
You're not alone.
Yeah,
It's a classic case of economics in action.
right.
Today, we're diving into your notes on trade and the big question of how we juggle unlimited wants with, well, a limited planet.
Yeah.
Let's get right into it with our expert.
Always a fascinating topic.
Mhm.
It's incredible how even centuries later, we're still grappling with that fundamental economic problem of scarcity. You've highlighted it perfectly in your notes.
It's like that saying, you can't always get what you want.
Right.
Except in this case, it's less about one Rolling Stones song and more about how entire societies try to make the most of what they've got.
Precisely.
Hmm.
Traditionally, we think of food, shelter, clothing,
Yeah.
the bare necessities. But you pointed out that in your research, things get a lot more clean water, for example.
Mm.
We often take it for granted. But your notes mentioned that 1.2 billion people already face scarcity. That really throws a wrench into things, doesn't it?
It's a stark reminder that what we consider essential varies wildly around the world,
Mhm.
and that those lists are constantly evolving. It makes you wonder, how do we even begin to tackle a problem that big?
Well, your notes offer a solution, albeit an imperfect one. Trade.
Okay.
It's the age-old system of exchanging goods and services to ideally benefit everyone involved.
Okay, let's unpack that. It's easy to say trade, but what does that really mean in practice?
Think of it this way. You want coffee, but your climate isn't exactly coffee bean friendly.
Yeah.
Trade allows you to get your caffeine fix by exchanging something your country does have in abundance, maybe lumber or oil, for those beans.
Okay.
That's a very simplified example, of course.
Right, because then we get into imports, exports, tariffs, like a whole other level of complexity. You've actually highlighted some fascinating points about comparative advantage in your notes. Want to elaborate on that?
Absolutely. It's a concept that explains why focusing on what we're best at producing can actually benefit everyone involved in trade. It encourages countries to specialize, leading to greater efficiency and, theoretically, more prosperity overall.
That's fascinating. So instead of trying to produce everything ourselves, we focus on what we do best and trade for the rest. It's like a giant global jigsaw puzzle where every piece matters.
Exactly. And like any good puzzle, it requires careful planning, cooperation, and, frankly, a bit of luck to get right.
It makes you wonder, though, about the real-world implications of all this. Like,
Yeah.
how do those comparative advantages play out on a global scale?
That's where things can get really interesting and where your notes on Canada's role in global trade come in.
Right.
Yeah.
We were looking at some figures earlier. Canada's a major player in exporting natural resources, especially to the U.S.
Yes, and what's intriguing is how your research highlights a growing concern about the sustainability of some of those exports.
Mm-hmm.
Lumber, for instance. With recent wildfires impacting forests, it raises questions about the long-term viability of that trade.
Wow, I hadn't even considered that angle. It shows how environmental factors can throw a real wrench into those carefully crafted trade agreements.
Absolutely. Global events, whether it's a pandemic, a natural disaster, or even a shift in political ideology, can disrupt these partnerships in a heartbeat.
Which makes those relationships all the more delicate, right?
Yeah.
Like you were saying earlier, it's about finding that balance, mutual benefit.
Mm.
But what happens when those benefits are perceived as unequal or, as we're seeing with Canada's lumber, potentially unsustainable?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And it's where innovation comes into play. Your notes touch on this, how humans are constantly trying to dream up new solutions, better systems.
It's like we're hardwired to innovate our way out of problems, whether it's figuring out how to irrigate crops in the desert or, as you mentioned earlier, developing complex trade networks.
Precisely. And you've highlighted some real game changers in your notes, the invention of money, for instance. Can you imagine a world without currency?
Honestly, I can barely remember what life was like before contactless payments.
Right.
But on a serious note, it's mind-boggling to think about how transformative something like that must have been.
It's a fundamental building block of our modern economy.
Mm-hmm.
And your research goes even further, pointing to the emergence of things like banking systems, joint stock companies, even the concept of laissez-faire economics.
Okay, now we're getting into the big leagues of economic thought. What's the key takeaway there?
It's about the constant evolution of how we manage resources. Laissez-faire economics, for example, argues for minimal government intervention in the market. It's the underpinning of capitalism as we know it, for better or for worse.
It's fascinating to trace that line from those early innovations to where we are now. And it makes you wonder, like, what's next?
Mm.
What are the economic challenges on the horizon that'll have us scrambling for new solutions?
Well, you hit on a big one earlier. water scarcity. Your notes paint a pretty sobering picture of the growing global water crisis. It's not just about having enough to drink, but also for agriculture, industry, everything.
And it's a problem that's only going to get more pressing with climate change, right? I mean, we were just talking about how wildfires can impact lumber exports. Imagine the ripple effects of widespread drought or flooding.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But your research does highlight some glimmers of hope. Scientists and engineers are working on incredible innovations to address the crisis.
Oh, tell me more. What kind of innovations?
Well, for one, there's a huge push for water-efficient technologies, from drought-resistant crops to smarter irrigation systems. And then you have advancements in desalination, which could potentially turn seawater into a viable source of fresh water.
Wow, that's incredible. It really drives home the point that innovation isn't just about coming up with new gadgets. It's about finding sustainable solutions to the challenges we face as a global community.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that economics isn't just about numbers and graphs. It's about people, choices, and the delicate balance of resources that sustain us.
It feels like we've barely scratched the surface today, but this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. Who knew that something as simple as choosing between a coffee and an online purchase could open up such a fascinating world of economic principles, global trade, and the quest for sustainable solutions?
It's all interconnected, and it highlights the power of informed decision-making. Because ultimately, every choice we make, from the products we buy to the resources we consume, has an impact on the world around us.
So the next time our listeners are debating between that fancy latte and a budget-friendly brew, they can impress their friends with their newfound knowledge of global trade, comparative advantage, and maybe even throw in a comment about water scarcity for good measure. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of economics. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this complex landscape. And to our listeners, keep those questions coming and that curiosity peaked. Until next time, happy exploring.